Okay, so hopefully that's working.
Is the time running in the right-hand corner?
It is.
Cool, we're on.
Thank you. All right, so back to these value principles that we were talking about. I stopped here with plottage. So plottage is an unusual term here, and it refers to the value that's created through the process of assemblage. So what's assemblage? Well, assemblage is sort of the opposite of subdivision. When you divide property up, you carve it up into smaller pieces. Sometimes that's a value-add proposition. You buy 40 acres of farm and you carve it up into 120 housing lots and put all the improvements in there. You can add a lot of value to that land. The same thing can be true when we're doing the opposite. Not perhaps with a subdivision so much, but perhaps with an area where you've got maybe a valuable corner for a commercial transaction. Maybe it's a valuable corner for a place like a Walgreens, for example, but the lot that's there is too small. But there may be next to it a couple of smaller, older, maybe even vacant commercial lots or houses that are not worth a whole lot in that particular area. And it might make sense to assemble all those parcels into one great big vacant lot and turn around and sell the whole thing to Walgreens. An example of this that came to me through a former student, he was an airline pilot, and he and a bunch of his coworkers invested in car washes. Well, at some point in time, they had the opportunity to invest in a piece of property out west of here, in a smaller town, and the piece of property they had was fairly deep, but not very wide. So you had a lot of extra land if you tried to put like a Wendy's or something like that up front, typical outlot, then you'd have all this excess land in back. It was almost kind of bowling alley sort of shape, but it's for a vacant lot. And next door, it was a larger piece of property that was also vacant, but not quite large enough for a really huge big box kind of store. It wasn't big enough to put a 225,000 square foot Meijer on it or something. So these guys got the idea that it would make sense to combine the two pieces. So they already owned one, so they put the other property under contract, and if I remember the story right, before they even closed on the second property, they realized that Walmart was sniffing around the area looking for a place. And neither one of those parcels was any good by themselves, but together they were able to sell the two to Walmart for a store, which is what plottage is all about. You can create value through assemblage, and we call that value increase plottage for whatever reason. So again, it comes back to some stuff we talked about back at the very beginning of class. You have to think creatively in terms of what you can do with property. Just because something is in a particular size, shape, or whatever doesn't mean that's the way it has to be or that's the way it should be for long-term value purposes. If you can rearrange things, alter conditions, then you can alter the value. Regression and progression is the idea that some things simply, impact the neighboring property value. So if you're out showing buyers homes in a particular subdivision, and this entire subdivision is in pretty nice condition, except for there's one really rundown, rough, hasn't been taken care of, going through foreclosure kind of home, imagine the impact of that not very well kept house, especially on the neighboring homes, right? Because now when you take your clients to show the house across the street or the house next door, they're going to be wondering, well, wait a minute, what about this thing next door, which is an eyesore where the grass is 3 feet high or whatever? That's the idea of regression. That rundown home is going to have a negative impact on all of the surrounding properties. On the other hand, it can only go down so much in value because of the progressive effect of all of the neighboring homes, which are in good condition in a desirable area. So, neighboring properties, just like with conformity, they have this impact on one another. And so it is true, I think, if you're looking to maximize dollars, that you're better off owning the least expensive home in the neighborhood if you're trying to say, how will it be affected by the impact on the other homes? They'll tend to sort of bring that value up. On the other hand, if it's not unique or unusual, then it might progress at a slower value. But in general, this idea of regression and progression is just that concept that neighboring properties are going to have an impact on that particular property due to condition and related factors. Substitution, like anticipation we talked about when we opened this section, underlies, is very fundamental, in this case underlies two of the three approaches to value, the cost approach and the sales comparison approach. With substitution, it's basically like, well, if I substituted a different property for this one, how would that look from a value standpoint? So in the sales comparison approach, we asked the question, what else similar to this property, hopefully what identical to this property has recently sold, kind of substituting the property that's sold for the one we're looking at and saying, if this were that, what would it sell for today? And in the cost approach, we do the same thing except based upon replacing it at today's cost. If we rebuilt it brand new today, what would that look like and feel like? So again, the idea that, you know, I could value something by substituting it for its equal somewhere else or in the neighborhood or back in time is a legitimate way to estimate value. Supply and demand, I think we probably talked about this, you know, more than we really need to. This is just a revisit of some of those concepts that are in chapter 2. Obviously, you can have, you know, increase or decrease in value. Things can decrease in value if there's inadequate demand, there's too much supply, you know, the buyer's market kind of thing, right? And even deflationary pressure is something that the Federal Reserve is still wrestling with. In fact, I think this housing prices, volume is up, average price is up, but the something in the market from February 2015 to February 2014, some indicators show that in some areas, at least anyway, house prices fell year over year for the first time in 3 years. Now it was again in limited areas, lower demand areas, but that can happen, and that's deflation, the idea that values would go down. The reason deflation is a problem, of course, if values go down, pretty soon your employer wants to start paying you less, and we don't want to see our wages decrease. Increases in values, just, you know, again, there's tons of demand for what's there. There's this inadequate supply right now that we've got that's, you know, going to help them to increase certain values. So it's that seller's market that we're on the cusp of again in some areas. And inflationary pressures, especially when you have a lot of new construction, wages are going up, building material costs are going up, and if the costs are going up, the markup the builders have to charge are going up. Lot values tend to rise along with it. So, you know, that's the basics of supply and demand. That's how we'll see them sort of play out in real property valuation. Questions about any of those value principles at all before we move on here? All right. So the three approaches to value that we're going to talk about here, they can be broken down into, you know, multiple stages. Particularly the income approach isn't really a single approach, and I'll go into a bunch of the different ones when we get there. But for the most part, we're just talking about a sales comparison or market type approach, cost approach, what does it cost to replace it today, and income approach, you know, based on the idea of what are the rents, either contract or likely. And then we can look at that in a lot of different ways. Not all of these income approaches are necessarily in the text. I think the yield capitalization method is not. You're not likely to see it on a test, but yet in my world, that's how properties are really valued, so I just wanted to address that. Okay, so the sales comparison approach, also known as this market data approach, is where we literally go and examine what like this property has sold. This is what you are likely to do when you're doing a CMA, because it really suits existing single-family housing. Even a single-family house that's being rented out is better valued through this sales comparison approach than it is through an income approach, because most people are valuing these kinds of properties based upon owning it and occupying it. That's the norm. All right, so with all of these approaches, it's helpful to understand what property type are they best suited for and what are the basic processes. And if you were asked a question or two about that process, could you answer those? That's really what you want to be able to do here. So again, for single family, existing single family, not brand new construction, this is the most reliable approach. Sales comparison approach isn't as good in other areas. No one of these three approaches we're going to look at is universally better across the board than the other. And in some cases, to get a good picture, you need all three. When it comes to single family housing today, sales comparison approach might be adequate all by itself. And in fact, if you're looking at single family refinance, this is probably all that's needed. What else similar to it in the same neighborhood within the last 6 months is sold? And that's probably good enough to give you that kind of picture. All right, so whether it's the property being appraised or the property that's the subject of your CMA, we call the property that you're evaluating, that you're trying to value, that's the subject property. It is the subject of this market study that you're doing, right? So we take that and we compare it to these comparable or comparable or comps that we call them, these comparable properties, and then we do this study. If you look at the text and they've got the grid, you've got the subject property, and you've got these 3 homes that have sold recently, the thing that we do is we try and identify what features matter. So we talked about this in a couple of different ways tonight. We talked about a fireplace versus no fireplace. That matters. Whether it's 3,000 or 5,000 or 20,000, that difference matters. You need to account for that when you're comparing property A that has already sold to property B that you're trying to sell or trying to value, because if they're not the same, it's one of those apples to oranges comparison. You need to figure out how to make these 2 properties at least academically similar, mathematically similar, so that you can get a true picture of what's likely to happen. So you go back and you look, around for these other comps, and you're looking for the twin. Sometimes that's not there, sometimes it is. If you think about a townhouse subdivision, for example, that kind of development, much more likely you're going to find very similar properties. There's not a lot of architectural difference on the outside. Maybe one faces a little bit differently than the other. Maybe one's got ceramic floors and the other has wood floors. Maybe one has the builder's upgrade package with taller cabinets and better windows and the other one doesn't. But it's not completely different styles or completely different looks. They're fairly similar. And it is possible that you'll find them similar. Also with housing, you get into a subdivision where the entire subdivision is built by the same builder. If you're trying to list or trying to value for a buyer the Applewood model, find the Applewood models that have sold recently and just focus on that. That's a luxury you don't always have, but the more similar the properties are, the more accurate your analysis will be, the less guesswork there is, and the more confidence you can have when you're presenting this to your client on either side of the table. Now, when appraisers do this, they'll study the whole market, but they'll probably only select 3, maybe 4 of the most suitable comparable properties, and that's all they will show to the client or whomever's going to end up seeing that appraisal. You as a broker can have 15 different property evaluations and show them all to your client if you want. The appraiser will keep his or her work in a working file so that it's there if they're called on, but they're not going to show all that because they don't sit down with the client and explain it. You get to sit down with your market analysis, explain it to your client, and then use that as a basis to kind of negotiate the asking price on the listing, or negotiate with your buyer the price you think they should offer and what they want to offer for that particular property. Appraisers don't have that opportunity or that luxury. So they will have the same amount or even more work in the file, but they'll show less because they're trying to keep it simple and clear and concise. We prefer within the last 6 months. That's great. That's not always possible. In 2008, I think it was, I did a CMA for clients, and nothing had sold in their subdivision in 16 months. Not one single house. That's kind of hard to do, what is the value today if nothing has sold? And that can happen to you. What do? Well, you have choices. Do I go outside of the subdivision and find other nearby subdivisions of a similar style and price range and features and amenities? Or do I stay in the subdivision and go farther back in time? Do I do a combination of both? There is no exact science right answer there. That's a decision you will make when you're doing your CMA as a broker, or the appraiser has to make when he or she is doing that value when they're going through and doing the sales comparison approach. All right, so now we select the comps. We find the ones that we think are the most similar. Again, maybe we have all Applewood models, or the other townhouses that are in the same building or that are nearest have the same view or the same finishes, whatever the case may be. And we have to figure out now how do we adjust for differences. You do have to watch out for this, though I'm not going to test you on this, and this is something a lot of brokers miss, but financing concessions. Well, what if the seller paid, the buyer's closing costs on one of those transactions, and that isn't going to happen on this other transaction most likely? You've got to factor that in because that has an impact. A buyer might pay more if the seller is giving them cash back at closing because it's the same net effect, right? And you don't want to use that. If you got one sale at 200, another sale at 202, and all of a sudden you got one at 210, there might be a reason for that 210, and it could be something as similar as buyer paid more because the seller gave them back $6,000 or $8,000 in closing to help them land the loan. You have to look for that kind of thing. That data may be in the MLS if it's properly entered by the previous listing agent. Market conditions, is it different? You know, if one house sold in June and it's now just August, probably no different. But if a house, the other houses you're using as comps all sold in October and now it's the end of March, beginning of April, and you're looking at a new selling season, you might make an adjustment for whatever the selling conditions were and they are today. That's very subjective. Sale conditions, you know, condition of the property. You know, we won't allow an FHA loan on our house. That could have an impact. It could limit the buyers. There's any number of factors that could be involved. You know, area preference, obviously that's, you know, location, location, location. It might be in the same subdivision, but one might be backing up to the interstate and the other might be backing up to the woods. You look at all these factors that really matter and try and make adjustments for them. Technically, you know, how do you do that? How do you determine, you know, what's the difference? How do I know what that fireplace is worth? How do I make that determination as to what that should or shouldn't be? Anybody have an idea how you sort of figure that out? Let's see if I have this here. I guess I'm kind of a little ahead of myself. This matched pairs analysis is the idea. So we'll come to this again. I don't want to lose that, but I didn't want to sort of backtrack on it. But the idea being that if you could, you would find two identical sales in that subdivision where they had one difference, and the difference would be the fireplace or the brick veneer instead of siding. And whatever the difference in the sale price between those two comps would be the hint at what the value of that one thing is. That almost never happens. So as I said to you before, if you specialize, if you really know a particular subdivision or a particular property type, it's easier almost instinctively, it's really deductively, but it almost feels instinctively to figure out that difference because you've been looking at a lot of sales in that subdivision. And you'll even remember, oh yeah, I remember that other house that sold had a 3-car garage, this one has a 2, I wonder what that difference looks like. And pretty soon, the more consistently you're valuing properties, the more comfortable you are that, yeah, okay, that's a $12,000 difference between a 2-car and a 3-car in the subdivision. Other times, you may never have sold in that town, and your data is probably, the application of the data you have in front of you is probably going to be less accurate. It's true for appraisers, and it's true for brokers. The more familiar you are with other sales and with properties that have sold, the more likely you are to be accurate in what you do. Now again, the appraiser is stuck using this URAR form. It's in the back of Chapter 19. You are not, but you might want to use a similar grid. So you've got 2 spots in the text to look at that. The example they give you here, where they're showing you in big print about the adjusting up and adjusting down, and then at the back of the chapter where they show you the whole blank form, gives you a sense of what appraisers think matters. So an appraiser may not think there's any difference between the vinyl and the cedar siding, but you might. You can adjust for it even if the appraiser does not. That's your professional prerogative. You just have to do it intelligently and in a way that your client can follow the bouncing ball so they understand what you're telling them. So as we're adjusting for the differences, these 2 acronyms, either CBS or CPA, I recommend you memorize so that you understand how this works, because mechanically, logically, it feels backwards in many cases. So back to our example of the fireplace. We have a subject property with no fireplace, for example, right? So this is the townhouse that does not have a fireplace in it. And all 3 comps that are identical to this property, except that they have a fireplace, right? We now have to adjust for that. So let's say that we have one that sold for 200, one that sold for 202, and one that sold for 204. A reasonable range, 202 to 204 for these 3 identical townhouses, and our townhouse subject is what we're trying to value. What value do we pick? Well, we could say 200 to 204, except we don't have a fireplace. So how do I adjust for that? Well, the first thing is I have to decide what's a fireplace worth. 3,000, 5,000, pick a number. You don't know? Try and figure it out from the MLS. Can't figure it out? Talk to brokers in your office. Ask your managing broker. Just get a sense of what you think it should be worth. If the construction is still going on, find out what the builder charges for the option. When housing is brand new, the value of options will tend to be fairly close to what the builder charged for them. Over time, the market will change that. And what was a $30,000 basement option may be worth $50,000 or may become worth only $15,000. as the market sort of comes to its own equilibrium in time. So when the comparable is better, this is the case we have, the comps all have fireplaces, we need to subtract. So we have this 200 to 204 range. We have our $5,000 opinion on the value of the fireplace. We would instead be looking at a value of between 195 and 199. We're going to subtract out that fireplace. What we're doing is not adjusting the subject, we're adjusting the comps, right? We don't know what the subject is going to sell for because it hasn't. But we know what the comps sold for, and we need to make them equal to the subject. So we need to remove the fireplace. We do that mathematically by saying, well, this place sold for 200, and this place sold for 204, but they had fireplaces, so what would they have sold for if they did not have a fireplace? You subtract out that $5,000 fireplace and you get a range of 195 to 199. Does that make sense? Again, if you just looked at it logically, you would say, wait, there's a fireplace involved, I must have to add money because I'm going to add a fireplace to my subject. No, you leave the subject alone and you add or subtract to the comps and you make the change that way. So that's why I recommend you memorize one of the two of these. If you're into television, memorize CBS. If you always wanted to be an accountant, memorize CPA. The idea here is, again, if the comp is poor, you add to the comp. If the comp is better, you subtract from that. And the result is the impact, what's left over is the number you should be valuing the subject property for. So you only adjust the comps. You never adjust the subject. A common test question in an area like this will be something like, well, what I just described. The subject has no fireplace. The comp has a fireplace. The fireplace is worth $5,000. What do you do? And there really are only four possible logical answers. You adjust the comp up, you adjust the comp down. You adjust the subject up, you adjust the subject down. What other four possibilities would there be but those? So the first thing you could do is, if it says about adjusting the subject, wrong answer, can't be possible because all we do is adjust the comp. And then if you remember, if the comp is better, subtract. In our case, you would remember, oh yeah, okay, the comp has the fireplace, it's better, therefore I'm going to subtract the 5,000. Then you've got the answer there. You don't have to instinctively get to that. Once you do market analyses regularly, you'll be able to do it fairly quickly and habitually. For now, you need to train yourself into thinking the proper way because, again, I think logically for at least half of you, it probably feels backwards when you go through and you do it the first time, right? And that's normal, right? So it's one of those things you have to train yourself in.
Okay, it's like accounting, pretty much.
Yeah, sort of in that regard, right,
That's how
right.
I felt when I took that. Like,
Yeah.
I was totally confused.
What-
But anyway, so the comps are the houses that you compare.
Right, they're the ones that have already sold in most cases.
Right, but you're adjusting them? How'd they go?
Because they have the fireplace and we don't want them to. We want the twin to our non-fireplace subject townhouse. So the only way to do that is to say, I'm going to remove the fireplace mathematically from those comps. I do that by subtracting $5,000 from what they sold for. Right, so because we know townhouse A, comp A, sold for $200,000 is my example here. So if I subtract 5,000 from that, now I can say it would have sold for 195 if it had no fireplace.
Okay,
And
so
now
then
it's
you're
a
coming to your,
you're coming to the subject, right? And now, and I'm kind of changing that into what I wish it had been to become the twin. And the more tweaks and adjustments you have to make to a comp, the less favorable a comp it is. Because if it's a fireplace here, then it's a cabinet style there, then it's a finished basement here. You know, pretty soon you've got so many adjustments, it's not a real good comp anymore. Because every one of these is a little bit of guesswork. And every time you guess a little on a fireplace, or difference in cabinet value, or hardwood versus ceramic, or upgraded window, every guess is an area where you could be wrong and kind of miss the market. So the best comps are those that require less adjustment. And again, the only way to do that is to kind of work through the exercise until you are just confident, okay, that's how it works. It feels backwards, but that's how it works. And I talked about match pairs analysis already, got ahead of myself there. I don't know if you'll get a test question on match pairs analysis or sales pairs analysis. I don't think it's in the book, if I remember right, but that's something that I studied in appraisal and remember running across that in one of my graduate courses as well. All right, so I think, was there anything else I wanted to do with that sales comparison approach? Oh, I know one other thing I wanted to mention here about all three of these approaches to value. They have very little to do with one another. So every time you look at a different approach to value, you have to stop thinking the way you were just thinking. So now we've talked about sales comparison approach, where everything revolves around what did the other similar properties sell for. Right? That's what that whole approach is all about. And because that works for single family housing stock, that's what you're going to do for a CMA. Not for any other reason, but just because that's the methodology that we want to use when we do our CMA or BPO. Same kind of thinking, same basic data and application. But now that we're done with that, we're done with that. So you got to stop thinking about that and look at the cost approach, because this is an entirely different way of coming to a value. We don't care anymore if we're looking at the cost approach what something's sold for. That's just meaningless to us. We're now looking at, well, let's say I have a unique property and there are no good sales comps, or it's a different kind of property, it's unique. You know, one of the ways to look at it is what would it cost to build this? So let's imagine, for example, that we are responsible for valuing Wrigley Field. Maybe it's for real estate tax purposes, maybe it's for refinancing purposes. Whatever it is, this is our appraisal assignment, to value Wrigley Field. How many 100-year-old historic ballparks have sold in the last 6 months in Chicago? How about in the country in the last century? Practically none. In fact, when Wrigley Field sold, when the Tribune bought the Cubs in 1980, they paid $20 million for the team. Who knows what they paid for Wrigley Field? $600,000. Now in 1980, I was, pretty young, but I bet I could scrape together 100 people who could have come up with 600 grand to buy Wrigley Field. And that was an option. Tribune didn't have to buy that at all, but that was the crown jewel. That's where the value is. It isn't in the team so much, it's in Wrigley Field. And the Wrigley family had a tax problem. They only sold because 2 Wrigleys had died in a very short period of time, and they didn't have the cash to pay the estate taxes. The only reason they sold. And so the Tribune company snatched up Wrigley Field for 600 grand, and within, 3 years, they spent $14 million to do one thing. What did they add to Wrigley Field after a few years? Lights, right? So they could play night games. So how do you value that? It sells for 600 grand, but you dump 14 million bucks into electricity and light bulbs. It has nothing to do with that $600,000 purchase price. And how much are the Ricketts and company putting into it today? I have no idea, right? But there's, it's very, very difficult to value. So one way to do that is to say, well, let's just do a cost approach. What would it cost us to build that today? 250 million, 750 million? What would it cost us to build it today? So that's the very first thing. The value of the whole thing. So they can look at the land first, and actually valuing the land in a cost approach is kind of interesting because we use the sales comparison approach to value the lot as if it were vacant. If you were talking about a house tear down, you might use that as a vacant lot value, for example. But otherwise, you want to know what, if I go to, Waveland and Ashland and all that, Clark, and if I go to that location and figure out what that land is worth there, what's that one city block worth, that's going to be the land value based upon any recent comps that I can find for them. Then, what would it cost to build it new? And there's one of 2 ways to look at that. One is to reproduce it exactly as it was, built the same way, same brick, block, everything. Another is to give you the same sort of functional utility. This is probably also ties in some cases with insurance claims, but for example, in a house, I want to give you a good example of Wrigley Field, but for example, in a house, let's say you've got concrete block and a face brick veneer hanging off of that. You've got 12-foot ceilings, you've got lath and plaster everywhere, and the thing burns to the ground. Unless you have the right kind of policy to rebuild it exactly the way it was, the insurance company is going to give you wood studs, brick veneer, 9 or 10-foot ceilings, drywall, right? They're going to give you the same functional utility, but they're not going to use the same materials because there aren't any plasterers left. It's very expensive. It's not what we do anymore. And that's the difference here between reproduction and replacement costs. So depending upon what the appraiser is trying to figure out, first thing they need to know, do we rebuild it exactly as it was, or do we rebuild Wrigley Field as a modern stadium with the same number of seats, 42,000 or whatever it is, but using current modern building materials? Those would yield 2 different costs to build. So you come up with that, and then you go, well, hang on a minute. I just estimated the cost of the land as it would sell today. And now I've estimated the cost to build Wrigley as if it was brand new, but what was it, like 8, 10 years ago? Chunks of concrete were falling off underneath the grandstand seats. You know, they had to put up mesh so nobody died at the ballpark. So that's not quite right. So we take this thing and we say, okay, fine, we've estimated what it would cost to build it today. Now let's bring it in line with the actual condition that it's in, and that's this idea of accrued depreciation. Depreciation in real estate, especially in this cost approach of appraisal, is a loss in value for any reason, including it's just old and nobody maintained it or whatever. So 3 different types of depreciation we're going to run across, and you should know these in case you get a question on something and be able to figure out which is which. The first type of depreciation that we're going to subtract is physical deterioration, and this is normal wear and tear. The paint fades, the roof wears out, the driveway settles and cracks, right? That happens. And so a house, once it's built, or any property, once it's built, what does it start to do immediately? It starts to decompose. And at some point in time, it's going to be like that cartoon where it's just going to go and turn to dust, right? And it'll just be gone. That's the way we're thinking here. And so as something ages and starts acquiring deferred maintenance, if we're doing it this way, saying, what's the value of the land in today's market? That doesn't change, no depreciation to that. That doesn't decompose anymore, it's already dirt. Then what does it cost to build it as if it were brand new right now? But hold on, we want to reduce that value by depreciation because it isn't brand new. It's old in some manner, or it's deteriorated in some way. That's depreciation, and we have to identify it. Now, with physical deterioration, normal wear and tear, we can do something as simple as like an age-life method, like, well, we're going to pretend the house has a 60-year life, and if it's 15 years old, we're just going to say it's 1/4 worn out. And maybe the construction cost is $200,000 today, but we're going to say it's really only worth $150 because it's got $50,000 worth of worn outness to it. It just got deferred maintenance that hasn't been done. That's the typical sort of straight line method of depreciation that the textbooks talks about. You can also look at deterioration and go, I'm not even sure this is curable. This gets back to our idea of increasing and diminishing returns and what makes sense to put money into. So when you're valuing something, you have to make a decision. Does it make sense to value it based on, well, if I put a coat of paint on the thing, what would it be worth? The answer really is only if putting paint on will increase the value, because you don't want to say, well, I'm going to spend $10,000 to do something to add $8,000 in value. That doesn't make sense in our appraisal process. Just value it as is otherwise. So curable physical deterioration is fairly common. If I spend the time, effort, and energy and money to fix it, I can make the place worth more. Incurable is it's not worth the investment. So you don't estimate it that way. Again, so physical deterioration is normal wear and tear, and it's curable if it makes sense to invest the money. It doesn't, I don't do it. I'm not going to value it that way if it doesn't make sense to invest the money currently. Another type of accrued depreciation is much different than what you would get with a typical straight line or typical sort of wear and tear on the carpet or whatever, functional obsolescence. This is where market conditions have dramatically changed. So an example of a house that's got a lot of functional obsolescence problems would be a 5-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a 1-car garage, no basement, on a slab, and a galley kitchen. You know what a galley kitchen is, right? It doubles as a hallway, right? You're trying to cook and do stuff, and people are running up and down the hallway. People don't want that. Now, maybe it's 2,500 square feet, and people love a 5-bedroom house, but 1 bathroom, what do you do with that? So this is a case of functional obsolescence. It's just functionally obsolete. I guess I priced this, house and said it should cost us $200,000 to build it new right now, but it doesn't have enough bathrooms. Well, the same thing can be true of Wrigley Field. Who gets all the bathrooms in the new sports venues? 2 to 1. Who gets the bathrooms?
Guys.
Women. Today, it's women. Just mechanical necessity, right? I mean, it just takes longer. So this is different because 20 years ago, who were all the people attending the sports venues? Men. Today, you get just as many female customers, and so you have to have a lot more bathrooms. So, if you rebuild something like Wrigley Field with today's model, you're not going to have enough bathrooms. Even something like US Cellular probably is old enough. It doesn't have enough bathrooms for women if it were built today. these kinds of things change. What people expect in the market changes. So maybe we can cure our functional obsolescence by taking one of those bedrooms and turning it into a bathroom. Now we've got a 4-bedroom, 2-bath. And maybe it was worth the money because that value is now more because there's greater demand in the market. That becomes a case of curable functional obsolescence, right? I mean, maybe the galley kitchen is, I can't fix it because I would lose too much, or maybe it would cost too much money. That's an incurable case of functional obsolescence. And that house is always going to have a galley kitchen, and it's always going to be something that can't be fixed or doesn't make economic sense to fix in your market analysis or your appraisal. The last category here is externalities. And externalities are always considered to be incurable. An externality, an example of that would be that house that's in the flight path of O'Hare. You can't move the house. Well, you move the house, but you can't move the property, right? The land is where it is. So it didn't matter that it cost you estimate $200,000 to replace that place. It's in the flight path of O'Hare. And it's always considered external, external is always considered incurable because there's nothing the property owner can do about it. So for example, if I take a house and put it here on Route 47 across from the college, and I take the exact same house and put it inside of Verona Ridge or something here on the west side of Aurora or wherever, same exact house, same exact estimate to construct that place, to reproduce it or replace it today, but one's on Route 47 with busy traffic and noise and whatever, and the other's inside of a nice, quiet, lovely, convenient to everything subdivision. You're going to have to get two different results. So how do you do that with the cost approach? An external bit of depreciation for the house on the busy road or at the O'Hare flight path or whatever. And you can't do much about being located on 47 or Randall Road or whatever. So that's the idea there of the types of depreciation. Again, normal wear and tear, marketplace obsolescence, and anything that's outside of the property owner's control. Those are those three different categories. Now once you've calculated this in whatever way you choose to do this, you simply subtract this accrued depreciation from the reproduction cost. So the value of land, which is what it is, the cost to build it today, which we know is too high, subtract from that the depreciation of whatever type we observed, and that then comes up with the value when we add all that stuff together. That's how a cost approach works. Now, you can do a cost approach for a house in about 5 minutes if you want. You can simply say, well, there's 2,400 square feet of house, and there's 900 square feet of basement, and there's a 474 square foot garage, and I think each one of them is going to be X, and boom, there it is. And that's all you would put into it. Because a cost approach in the typical house appraisal, if you even do one, it's like a backup. It's like a check to just say, does my sales comparison approach look reasonable? The only times you get into cost approach with housing, for single family housing, for any significant impact, is if it's new construction, in which case the appraiser values the prints, right, and is doing everything out of a cost estimate book because there is no existing house to value. Or in the case where it's so unique, you need to do a backup to make sure that the comps you've used look approximately reasonable. Otherwise, you're probably only going to do a cost approach on unique properties or to-be-built properties. Questions about any of that at all? All right, let's see. Talked enough about, and the complexity, this is one thing you can forget about this entirely. Any of this, kind of these different methodologies, I teach construction estimating and did it for 10 years. This is not something you need to know. Unless you're going to somehow get into really complex property stuff or become an appraiser, you don't ever need to look at that. But there's lots of different ways to value this. Something like an estimate of Wrigley Field might in fact require a complete engineered cost estimate that would take 2 people 4 weeks to do. Something like a house, like I mentioned, you could do in 5 minutes. So it really kind of depends upon what the assignment is, but I wouldn't worry about what any of those mean or are trying to explain to you. And I talked about all that stuff already. Okay, so let's move over to income approach. So here, we're really going to be talking about the direct capitalization approach. What the book talks about mostly under income approach is direct capitalization. And this is used. It's not really used as much as you might think based upon reading this book. I don't think it's used all that much at all. It's fairly straightforward, but anyway, it's it's something we can talk about, and because you might get tested on a few of these things. So we have three main component parts here. We have income, we have a capitalization rate, which is a kind of a capitalized rate of return, and then we have value. And this is the case where value and price could be interchanged. So the book has, and I have on the slides, this little ERV formula that we'll look at in a minute, a little ERV diagram, because it's kind of helpful to have. But it's also important to understand, what we're talking about here. The income we need isn't just any old income. It's specifically defined as net operating income. And we'll get to that math here in just a moment, to how you get there. The rate is a capitalized rate of return that's determined by kind of going in and doing market research, seeing what other similar properties have sold for in terms of what the investor was expecting to earn on their money, and using that cap rate or that percentage or decimal we get from that calculation and applying that to other similar properties. So all Walgreens sold across the United States will have similar cap rates, for example. All suburban office buildings will have similar, within a range, cap rates. Apartment buildings will tend to have their own cap rate range that you're likely to see, which could be completely different than what you're going to get if you were looking at, industrial buildings. So again, cap rate is just a mechanism that we use to establish a value for a particular income stream within a particular real estate asset class. And again, here value may mean market price. If you're predicting, if you're setting an asking price or predicting a future sale, it's value. If you're historically looking at the record, then it's price. Because if you have to go in and see, well, what did the last apartment building sell for, it's market price you're looking for. But you use that market price along with the current cap rate to make a prediction of what you think market value would be. So to get to NOI, to get to net operating income, and the book, this is all laid out in the book, we first start with what's called potential gross income or gross potential income. It's the screaming highest possible amount of money the building could possibly generate in a one-year period. So if you're talking about an apartment building, you're talking about clubhouse rental and laundry concessions and swimming pool memberships, whatever you can charge money for, parking spaces, whatever you can charge money for, including, of course, apartment rents, goes into this potential gross income. Every possible nickel that property could conceivably generate during an entire year. 100% occupancy, no vacancies, everything. That's where we start out. What's the highest possible amount that this building could generate? Now, in my experience, whatever that number is, it never happens, ever. People move out, somebody doesn't pay you, you don't rent the clubhouse every day of the year, whatever. I mean, there's just stuff happens. So we take that potential gross income and we apply to it vacancy and credit or collection losses. I think in the book they have one line for 4%, 5%. I look at them as two separate lines. Again, you're going to have vacancy loss simply because people come and go. When the housing market was booming in 04, 05, 06, occupancy rates for rental properties were fairly low. High 80s, low 90s, because people were leaving to do what? Buy houses and buy condos and townhouses and whatever. Occupancy rates have increased significantly, but that may go the other way again. If you have a lot of new construction, a new apartment complex opens up a mile away, people start moving out to go to the newer place, especially maybe they can get a rent concession. So again, you have vacancies, move in, move out. Even if you can rent it in a week, you still had some percentage of vacancy. So you subtract whatever you think from the PGI is most likely vacancy and credit losses. Credit and collection losses are the people are there, the unit's not vacant, they just haven't paid you. They're in arrears or they're bouncing checks or whatever. That happens on all kinds of properties. So I would tend to make these separate numbers and look at vacancy at whatever the current market is, and then I would make an additional estimate for credit and collection losses that you're just invariably going to have. Tenants do not come up to you and voluntarily give you extra money, but there are times when you don't get from them what you thought. That's just the norm, as you can imagine. So when you subtract the vacancy and credit losses from the PGI, you get effective gross income. This income now is what you actually expect the property to generate. So back to our property management chapter, this is what you would predict for the income. This is what your budget would be based on. This is the amount of money we expect to have coming in. But that's still not the right income for what we're looking for. We still have to subtract out what we consider operating expenses. Right, so we take the effective gross income, which is the potential gross income minus our vacancy and credit losses, and we take that effective gross and we subtract out the OpEx, or the operating expenses. Now, before we get to the bottom of this, I would like you, if you have your books open, if it's handy, to look at the list of operating expenses that are there. And then, while you're glancing at that, think about at the same time what's not there. In other words, what is the biggest single expense that we equate with real estate ownership and operation that is not on that list? Of operating expenses. What's missing?
Depreciation?
Well, no, because that's not really an operating expense. That's a tax nicety, or it shows up in the other thing. What do you write the biggest check for normally at home? Where does most of your money go to? The mortgage. Is that on there? No principal, no interest. We don't care about debt service. This analysis is without regard for how the property is financed. Because that analysis changes. The more money you put down, the more you change the equation. 10% down investment is not going to give you the same return on your investment as a 20% down, or as 30% down, or if you pay cash. So the direct capitalization approach, this income, this net operating income we're looking at, is completely without regard for whether the building is financed at all. It's all done based upon if it was a cash sale. It's telling you this is the building's ability to generate cash. Some buyers are cash buyers. What do you suppose? Do you think Blackstone could write a check for $1.3 billion to purchase Willis Tower? Or do you think they're going to finance that? Got one for finance. Anybody think they have that kind of cash? Do you know that they and some of their investors just sold an industrial portfolio of real estate for $8.1 billion a few months back? So maybe they do have enough cash. They'll probably finance it though. But do you suppose that'll be one bank that loans that money, or a whole bunch of them? I think that'll probably be quite a few banks. No one bank's going to take that risk. Willis Tower has been a bit of a dodgy investment over the years. It's tough to own the biggest thing in town. Anyway, so our NOI is what we get to when we subtract the operating expenses from our effective gross income. And again, we don't care about debt service. And that's the term in the industry for mortgage payments, the debt service, principal and interest. Taxes is an operating expense, right? Any insurance cost would be an operating expense. So we're just talking about the debt service. The only thing that changes is whether you finance the property. And that's a separate issue from the building's ability to generate cash. So here, nice big picture. Took me like an hour to figure out how to replicate this thing. Every time I see it now, I go, oh yeah, I did artwork. Isn't that awesome? So I affectionately refer to this as IRV. And this is a nice tool because you don't have to memorize the 3 different formulas here. You just have to memorize IRV. Because the formulas are built in here. So what this tells us, and what's going to show us on the next slide, is that this is 3 formulas built into one. I over R equals V. And I over V equals R. And R times V equals I. I don't have to have those memorized at all. All I need to do is have this picture pop into my head. And if I'm given 2 out of those 3, this diagram tells me how to calculate the third. And you could do that. So here they are. These are the formulas right here that we just got done talking about on the next slide. Right? Net operating income is equal to the cap rate times the market value. So I equals R times V. Cap rate is equal to the net operating income divided by the market value. See, this is just cumbersome. this is just awkward to try and remember all this words and stuff. But with IRV, I can think, okay, what are they asking me? I, that's NOI. If I don't have the net operating income, I can calculate it because I can take the potential gross, subtract out vacancy and credit problems, get to effective, subtract out the operating expenses, get to NOI. Now I've got NOI. So, once I've got that, if they give me, either one of the other two, I can, with net operating income and market value, I can tell you what the cap rate is for the property. So here's how cap rates are determined. If we wanted to know what are the cap rates for CVS versus cap rates for Walgreens, do investors care? One of those, will investors pay more or less money for one or two of the others? Let's say we have a corner. And we have a corner that's perfect for either one, and both Walgreens and CVS are willing to come and rent from us. That's an income stream. And they're willing to pay the exact same rent for a building that's going to cost the exact same amount. Wouldn't we like to know, as investors, if the income stream from one of those is worth more to investors than the other? The only way to do that is to look at the market. So you go into the market and you say, show me all the CVS properties that have sold anywhere in the area or the country or whatever I need for the last 6 months or a year. And I take from those, I take the NOI, whatever the net operating income was from that, which is all based upon the lease from one of those two retailers, divide that by the market value, which in that case would be the market price, what it actually sold for, and it's going to give me a decimal. And that decimal can be converted to a percentage, and that's the cap rate. And they're probably going to be somewhere in the 5 to 6 range, which means that investors are saying, we're willing to take as little as a 5 to 6% return on our money after we pay cash to buy a CVS or a Walgreens, which is a pretty low rate of return. And by the way, if you pay attention to how this formula works, the lower the cap rate, the higher the value. Low cap rate means high value. Another thing that feels backwards until you run the numbers and see how it works. So once I know that, okay, the cap rates are between 5 and 6% for CVS and Walgreens, now I can take this cap rate and I can apply it to any property that for which I have the NOI. So let's just say that 5% is the cap rate for our Walgreens or CVS. So now I could go anywhere in the country, do my own study on what the NOI is for a Walgreens or a CVS, divide it by that cap rate, and it's going to tell me that's what investors are willing to pay for that property, period. End of discussion. It's all the more I need to know. Because it's all about the income, right? That's what drives the value here of the property. And if I don't know what the NOI is, but I know what the cap rates are, and I know what something's sold for, I can estimate the net operating income for the property because I know what investors have typically been paying. So that's the whole idea of this IRV formula, is that I can use these three different formulas to predict or estimate approximate values for net leased income properties, industrial buildings leased to some manufacturer or warehousing or distribution company, retail buildings, office buildings, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Everybody following that okay? Again, you're looking at a question or two at most, and I don't think I have any complex math questions here. You could get a math question, though, regarding IRV at the state exam, and you just need to be able to mechanically know how to plug in the numbers. Hence, I recommend you memorize IRV. So a good illustrative example that I've given you here to study is, all right, and this is kind of back to what I said, that it feels backwards. So in our first example, $10,000 income. So this property or this asset is generating a $10,000 income stream. The investors wanted a 10% rate of return on that $10,000. That gives it a value of $100,000. Just run the numbers, IRV, right? I divided by R equals V. 10,000 divided by 0.1 is going to give you $100,000. So and this is true with that, valuing any asset. That's how it would work. So on the opposite side of the screen, we have a test problem. If the cap rate is 20%, what happens to the value? So the cap rate is doubled, so the value is going to, feels like it would double, right? But what did I warn you about? It's backwards. This investor is saying, for this $10,000 income, I don't like it as much. I demand a 20% return. Therefore, I'm only going to be willing to pay half as much. So this number here is 50,000. Run the math. 10,000 divided by 0.2 is 50,000. So again, it's another one of those things you got to get accustomed to, just sort of running the numbers. And this example of 10,000 divided by 0.1 equals 100,000 is a way for you to also memorize this. If you could ask a question that says something like, If the income remains the same, but the cap rate doubles, what happens to the value? You don't even have to remember the lesson. All you have to do is, oh, hang on. All I have to do is do this one, I get this, and then I can just double this, and I can rerun the math, and you can see the answer, right? So, I mean, this is a fairly simple way to remember it. This is how I got accustomed to the sort of, again, backwards thinking math. This is a critical area if you ever get into investment property. Cap rates that are higher mean we don't like the income as much, therefore we're going to demand, we're willing to pay less for it. An example of this is, again, it's an income quality issue. So let's go back and stick with Walgreens. So on one corner of an intersection, we have a Walgreens. And we have, let's say an investor group has given us $10 million in cash with which to buy a retail property in our little town. And there are only 2 for sale. The Walgreens, and on the opposite corner, there is a retail development which has all mom and pop stores. And mom and pop shops, I mean, you know, small businesses, nobody's ever been in business before. This is their only location, no national credit tenants, nobody that anybody would know. Not that they're not worthy, not that they're not reliable, we just don't know anything more about them. Can't you just see, assuming Walgreens is going to pay its bill every month, and with the other tenants, well, we hope they do. So you've got the same amount of money being generated by both of these properties. They're generating the exact same amount of NOI. In our example here, it's only 10 grand. Imagine it's $1 million in net operating income from these 2 properties. Are you going to be willing to pay the same for the Walgreens as you are for the mom and pop development? They're generating the same income. Let's even estimate that they would cost exactly the same to maintain. Are you going to treat those 2 incomes as being identical? Yes or no? You think there's a good chance that anybody in that small mom and pop business group doesn't know what they're doing and is going to be out of business and is going to have to stop paying rent or is going to have to slow down? That's a real good chance. Happens all the time. Walgreens, on the other hand, huge company, tons of cash, publicly traded, national credit tenant. You can bank on that kind of thing. So this is where you get differences in cap rates. For Walgreens, we'd be willing to get as little as a 5 or a 6% return. Whereas the mom and pop stores, we might require an 8 cap, a 9 cap, a 10 cap, because we demand a higher return because it's a riskier investment. That's how cap rates work. Cap rates tend to be very low on ground leases where all you own is the dirt. You don't have any responsibility. You just collect cash, and your tenants are people like McDonald's or a bank. Nothing to do but collect money. Very low cap rates, 4.5%, 5%, not uncommon. Apartments tend to be fairly low. Why are cap rates on apartments so low? Because everybody needs a place to live. So apartments are one of the more stable investments. They're also easier to finance. You can get consistent long-term 30 and 40-year financing on apartments that you cannot get on office buildings, industrial buildings, or retail properties. Any other questions at all about that direct capitalization approach? All right, so staying with an income approach, but just moving, and we'll do this fairly quickly at this point. Just want to point out that here, gross rent multiplier or gross income multiplier is a quick and dirty back of the envelope or napkin at lunch way to quickly sketch out the value of residential rental properties. If I know, for example, what the gross rent multiplier is that's typical in Aurora, I can apply that to the monthly rent of any 1, 2, 3, or 4 unit property in Aurora and get a rough idea what it's going to sell for. Literally, I mean, again, you can do that in a matter of minutes. I once spent time driving around Joliet, literally with a pencil and paper in the seat next to me, and every time I would get to a building, I was on the phone with my client, and every time I would get to a building he was interested, I would kind of look at it, and we would talk about it over the phone, and we would kind of look at the gross rent multiplier range for Joliet, which, by the way, was much, much lower than the gross rent multiplier up here. In fact, I think if I remember at the time, this was 98 or 99, the gross rent multiplier in the Joliet that I was running across was between 70 and 80, whereas in St. Charles or Geneva it was over 200. People were willing to pay 3 times as much for the same income stream there as they would have down there. It's just fascinating. It was a very quick and dirty, simple, easy thing. Now, the same thing is true with gross income multiplier with multifamily 5 units and larger, except we use annual income. And anything other, it's not just rent, and we say income like again parking lot rental or what clubhouse rental, etc. But these are approximations because things that they don't factor in, who's paying for utilities? Right? On one house, the landlord pays for some of them, and the next house, he doesn't. Same thing is true with apartments. Some cases you have things metered, in some cases you don't. Some buildings are just better quality than others. You know, what's the property condition? That's not taken into account either in these. So it's a real quick and dirty way. Did we ever do it? Yeah, I once sold a duplex in Batavia off of nothing but a gross rent multiplier. My client had two places side by side, and their thinking was that what they paid for those properties mattered, which I hope you get right now has nothing to do with this. It's nowhere in this equation at all. It's all about the rents and the cost of operating the property. That's what matters for income producing property. So they had two duplexes side by side. And we got two offers on the one that they decided to put on the market. And let's just use a number, say they came in at $200,000. And the other buyer who didn't get that property was pretty disappointed. And so, but they weren't willing to pay any more because the market rent was the market rent. You don't just overpay for income. So I said to my clients, well, what about that other place you just bought last year? They said, oh, we just bought it last year. We can't have made any money on it. I said, well, based on what? You know, so they had paid like $160 for the building next door. But I said to them, why aren't the rents the same? They said, well, they will be. We just haven't had a chance to get rid of those tenants. So I explained to them the fact of life where if you can turn the lease over, what do we talk about, you know, in leasing? Then it's not a net lease, you know, it's a fee simple interest, and you value it based upon the economic rent, not based upon the contract rent. So they sold that building. They made almost no money at the first one that they sold for $200. They'd owned it for 3 years. It was a maintenance nightmare, and the husband was glad to get rid of it, and I think really wished his wife had never purchased the property, which she did without him, basically. The other property that they bought for $160, we sold that for $195. They made $35,000 in one year, and on the other in 3 years they made probably 10. And why? Because they underpaid because the seller of the second unit was foolish enough to sell it to them based upon the rents they had or were getting, not the rents in the marketplace. So instant cash. And they couldn't see that, but this was the lesson. Look, if building A you own sells for a gross rent multiplier of 150 and building B is largely the same, it's going to sell for the same rough price. It's just that simple. So I never gave them an asking price, and I never had a listing agreement. Probably not good to tell you that, but the when the other people said, well, what are you asking for it? I said, well, here, you know what the other one just sold for, and you know what the market rents are. Just make an offer based on that. They made the offer, and my clients bit, and that was the end of it. Went straight to a sales contract. So I mean, you can use this information if you get accustomed to it. Anyway, so that information is all in the text. It's just up there for you to see. Now, I just wanted to address the fact that on really sophisticated investment deals, what tends to be used is something called a yield capitalization approach, which is also known as discounted cash flows. So if you've ever heard this term of DCF or discounted cash flows, this is where it comes into play in real estate. And this is the way an appraiser or an investor should value significant real estate properties, not the direct capitalization approach of IRV. IRV is a decent way to do something, but it's not as sophisticated as this, and this is more commonly done today. This is complex enough that if I don't get myself retrained, I can never remember how to do it. I mean, I literally have to sit down and look at charts and lessons and things, because I don't do it very frequently at all. But that's kind of the normal thing. So I just wanted to mention that. Also, a cash-on-cash return or return on investment is a different analysis. So back to IRV, I mentioned that if you paid cash for the building, IRV can also work as a cash-on-cash kind of thing. But what if you financed it? What if you put down 30%? Then what would that analysis look like? Well, that's an ROI kind of analysis. Now you look at the 30% cash you put in and analyze what's the return on that, because that's all you have invested. The other 70% of the money belongs to the bank, and they're getting their money in the interest. So that's a different kind of analysis. So sometimes investors talk about cash-on-cash returns. That's this ROI or return on investment kind of thinking. Again, just want you to have heard the terminology, and if you're interested in doing more investing stuff, then you probably should study investment. Fortunately, it doesn't matter whether you're investing in the stock market or real estate, the analyses for a yield return or an ROI are the same. So you can find this kind of stuff fairly readily online. Now, ultimately, an appraiser who's done a sales comparison approach with multiple comps, a cost approach and an income approach, which this is what I would get on my office building in town here. We would get an income approach where most of the weight would be placed, but they would also do a cost approach, and they will also look at recent sales, to, you know, for no other reason than to come up with cap rates. So we'll get all three approaches on a building like that. But ultimately, that appraiser's still got to put one value on it. And maybe the income approach says the building's worth $5 million, but the cost approach says it's worth $6.25. And the sales approach says it's worth somewhere in between. They got to come up with one single number. How do they do that? Well, they use their professional expertise and opinion, and they come up with something they're comfortable with. The one thing you should know about this, is it is not a mathematical process by itself. It is not a matter of averaging them. You don't take the mean, the median, or the mode and just be done with it. They literally have to look at it and make a determination. It's a kind of an educated opinion. So I've seen residential real estate appraisals, for example, where all they've got are the three comps from the sales comparison approach, and one of those comps is exceptionally good. And the other two are wild guesses, but they're the closest they could find, and they put 100% of their analysis in the reconciliation process on one single comp. Perfectly acceptable if that's the appraiser's judgment of the best analysis of the value. So reconciliation is simply the process of taking all this data that you assembled as an appraiser and coming up with a single final estimate of market value. Two different appraisers will come up with two different values. I tell you the story about my former student that had two house appraisals that were $350,000 apart. Right? It was all based upon an in-ground swimming pool. One gave him no value for it because that was his opinion in the market, and the other appraiser gave him cost approach because that was his opinion. I mean, there was my student. How do I reconcile these values? The three, you know, one's at $1 million, one's at $1,350,000. In-ground, indoor swimming pool. What's it worth in the market? You know, I mean, those appraisers had two different opinions. I've had commercial appraisals on the same property, 20 to 25% apart. On my office buildings, a prime candidate for that. Since we talk about the incomes, the likelihood of the tenant paying the income stream, just stop and think for a minute what I deal with on a regular basis. 44% of the building that I manage has been leased for 23 years to the state of Illinois. 43% of the income, the potential gross income from the building, comes from the state of Illinois. What do you think the likelihood is of that tenant making good on rent over a 5 or a 10-year lease? For 23 years, I've heard the same thing from lenders and appraisers. The state of Illinois is not creditworthy. You think they're more or less creditworthy today? Just keeps getting less and less. And oh, by the way, in those leases, the state of Illinois has the right, this is part of one of their administrative rules, for any lease that they sign, if the General Assembly fails to fund the department adequately, they can give us 120 days, that's 4 months' notice, and vacate without penalty. So when an appraiser values that building, they look at those 5 and 10-year leases sometimes, when they have that much left on them, and give us credit as if the state was leasing 4 months at a time. Totally different view of how steady and stable that income is, right? Completely different perspective. So if you get one appraiser who goes, I think the state's going to stay, they give you full market value for that rental income. It's the state, it's the king. How are they going to default? They can't file bankruptcy. It's not a legal option for them. And you'll get another appraiser who goes, the king's a bum. I'm not going to give them much value because they got this right to leave and they're in terrible financial shape. So you can get these huge swings in value. That's the appraiser's opinion as to what to do with that stuff, and they do it in the reconciliation process in part. There's a bunch of other data here I've just added, so that, again, so that you can have it, but you're not going to get tested on this. I thought it would be helpful for you to have. What I do want to touch on here is your role as a broker. You might help the appraiser by making sure they have comps. Appraisers today don't always appraise in the area that they're coming to. You get an appraiser from Palatine, come out and appraise in Sugar Grove. Maybe never been here before, don't know the market, don't know the area. They just do stupid stuff. They don't know what subdivisions make sense. The appraisal looks stupid when it's all done. So you can always ask them, do you have adequate comparable data? Do you need it? And maybe it isn't just the MLS, but maybe recent FSBOs about in the neighborhood that closed at higher prices that you might want to give them. So whether you're the buyer's agent or the listing agent, know the comp data for a house and offer it to the appraiser to make sure they have the best comps to support the value. Don't argue with an appraiser after the fact. unless you've got data that can show through appraisal methods why the value should be higher. But to call them up and say, you've killed my deal, is immaterial, because an appraiser should react, so I'm being faithful to what I see the market value as. So you have to argue on the merits on the thing. Again, you're gonna assist in scheduling the whole appraisal, get them access, they need to be able to get in, and provide them with whatever else they might need. If a survey is available, give them a survey, it saves them a little bit of time, or whatever else you need to do to provide them with the data that they need. Ask, be helpful, be supportive. Remember that the appraiser works in a sale transaction for the lender. They don't work for the buyer, they work for the lender. Today we use these appraisal management companies. We got another 5 or so minutes to go here, then we'll finish up. Appraisal management companies are part of what was put in place recently to separate the appraisers from the lenders and the brokers. So most lenders today use appraisal management companies so they never interface directly with the appraiser. That way they can't be accused of unduly influencing the appraiser to come in with a high value. That way they can't be accused of saying something like, hit my value or you'll never work for us again. They don't even assign the appraisal company. They call an appraisal management company who picks the appraiser or appraisal firm. Okay, so it's not a requirement, but it's a way to prove appraiser independence, which is part of the most recent law. And it'll be up to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to enforce all of this stuff. So that's the basic idea of that. But this is why you're getting appraisers from out of the area coming and appraising, and sometimes the stuff they do just doesn't make any sense to you. In other words, literally, remember, particularly with houses, you might know the market better than the appraiser, even though the appraiser might have more valuation experience. So that's why you offer them assistance. All right, last thing here. This is a kind of a test sort of question. We've had this in a couple of chapters. So basic quick lesson, lender's loan based upon the loan to value. And they base on the lower of either the appraised value or the sales price. This is true for residential property. And this is secondary mortgage market, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac rule, so there really isn't any way to get around this. So if a house sells for $200,000 but appraises at $180,000, what happens? That's really the question here, right? So what happens if the purchase price says $200,000 but the appraisal comes in at a value of $180,000? So if I told you just in a test question, if I said this was an 80% LTV loan, this is the bottom thing here. If I said to this, it's an 80% LTV loan, sales price is $200,000, the appraisal is $180,000, how much is the lender going to loan on the property? That's a legitimate math question you should be able to answer. That's a good in-practice question. So you've got an extra number up there you don't need, but you got to figure out which one is important and which one is distraction. So what will the lender loan? 80% of what? Of the 180. The 200 becomes completely meaningless because the lender's going to say, I don't care what you paid. This is all that it's worth according to our appraiser, so we'll loan you 80% of that. Whereas if the appraisal came in at 220, they would tell you, we don't care what the appraisal is. We're going to go with the sale price. That's how it works. So if you ever wonder, well, why don't appraisers ever come in much above, when you get a positive appraisal, why aren't they ever much above the market value or the sale contract? What's the point? Nothing good can come of it because it provides no value to anybody to have an appraisal that's much higher than the sale price because no lender is going to use that. They'll only use this. So again, be prepared to answer this kind of a test question and be prepared to deal with this in practice. As you have appraisers who are traveling or are unfamiliar with areas, so then the question, if you get this, what do you do? Now you're only going to get 80% of 180 instead of 80% of 200. You're not going to get the $160,000 loan. You're only going to get what, 140, 144 or something, whatever that number is. What do you do? That's the first question. Does the deal die? Does it stay afloat? How do you deal with it? Maybe the seller has to take lower price. Maybe the buyer's got to come up with more cash. Maybe the deal falls apart entirely. If the deal's contingent on financing, it would be nice to assume that the lender won't make a loan and therefore they can't do it. But being contingent on financing is actually probably a little bit different than being contingent on the appraisal coming in where you expected. Some brokers will suggest to their client they add that provision. Maybe not so much today, but 3-4 years ago, that was a fairly commonplace thing. I think appraisals are getting a little bit more consistent with the market, but still, it's kind of funky. And having been in that situation, with some big dollar differences, you gotta be able to figure out pretty quickly what you're gonna do. Questions about anything at all from chapter 19? All right, so when we get together on Thursday night, forget anything I told you before. But when we get together on Thursday night, we're just going to focus mostly on real estate development and zoning that goes along with it, the stuff in chapter 20. I probably won't get into real estate careers at all. And so that's what we're going to focus on. We may even watch a video. We'll see what I've got time to sort of pull together. There'll be one or two questions out of chapter 20 that are worthy of test question stuff for the course. But there's a lot that's in there that's worth knowing about, depending upon what kind of real estate stuff you want to be involved in. So I might pick one well-known case study that we'll watch a video on and spend some time talking about after we go through the chapter stuff. So we'll pick up on real estate careers next Tuesday, assuming that I'm here and I'm planning to be. But if for some reason I'm not, I'll post that stuff online, and that would be a class we would just skip. Otherwise, Thursday night, just have read chapter 20. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to hang out. Otherwise, have a good couple of nights. Try and stay dry.